Okay, thank you and welcome, and thank you for coming and listening to my work. I am completing a draft, very first draft of a general introduction to what I'm calling scholarship and collecting in Timbuktu, which will span the period from say the 12th century, very briefly, but substantially from the 16th century to the 20th century. And I have about 8 or 9 chapters, very preliminary, but I've got the grand narrative sorted out, as it were. And this is chapter 4. And it focuses on the most famous figure from the scholarly world of Timbuktu, a man called Ahmad Baba. And in this chapter in particular, I look at his exile from Timbuktu to Marrakesh. So I just wanted to, I will read some of the text, and but before that, I'll give you some background very briefly. So you'll see Marrakesh right at the top in that map there. It's around 1,000 kilometers, and in the 1590s, a state based at Marrakesh. It wasn't yet Morocco, the unified Morocco we need today. They were competing sultanates or emirates, competing quite energetically and violently amongst each other. And there were a host of European interests along the coast, particularly Portuguese. The Portuguese had come from the 1405 already. There are enclaves here. One can still see forts and traces of Portuguese presence. And English merchants, very important commercial firms, Dutch coming down along the coast. And the dynasty based in Marrakesh, it's a complicated story, but in the 1590s, probably pressed by all these interests and by the Ottomans based around there, they decide to send an expedition into and across the Sahara and eventually conquer the capital of the Songhai state called Gao. And after a year or so in Gao, they decide to move their capital and their sort of encampment to Timbuktu. Timbuktu from 1591 to early 1593 had been left largely to its own devices, not really concerned of the conquerors of the Songhai. The leaders of the expedition were largely Iberian mercenaries. That's a subject for another discussion, but let us just show you a few more images. So this is what we're talking about. This is the Saadian state, the extent after they had conquered Gao, that would be Gao, Timbuktu, a massive territory. This is an image of Marrakesh during the Saadian state, and these are the tombs. So I want to show you these things because Marrakesh at this time in the 1590s was going through a renaissance architecturally, intellectually, religiously, in every sphere. It was really at its height. And then, of course, with this arrogance also pressed partly from the margins by European and Ottomans, and then also this going into Timbuktu. And what happens, they don't find as much gold in Timbuktu as in the Songhai space as they had imagined. One of the terms for this region of the Sahara, as we all know, teach African history, is called Bilad al-Sudan, which is where Sudan comes from, which means the land of the blacks, which was simply a descriptive term. But the other term that the medieval Arabic writers referred to this region is Bilad al-Tibr, and Tibr means gold dust. So there was a long-term consciousness about the presence of gold in this region. This is, for instance, the image of the Catalan cartographer Cresques. This is a fantastic image of Africa, at least of Northern Africa, from 1375. The first mention of Timbuktu on a map, and this is the famous Mansa Musa sitting on holding a golden staff, etc. So there's a long image of Africa as having gold. When the Saadians enter, they actually don't leave with much gold. It's pretty much a kind of unsuccessful conquest in terms of what they were going to get from this region. What happens and what is my focus? So in the first few pages, I outline this background and then focus on a scholar, a number of families they send into exile. And we know the names of only a few of them. So they, from 1593, October 1593, they send, September, October, they send on a march across that territory, 1,000 kilometers, to Marrakesh, the scholar Ahmad Baba. So just brief background quickly. He's born in Timbuktu in 1556 from a family with a prestigious scholarly lineage. He is educated by his father and his uncles and some scholars to the south, from the south of Timbuktu, whom he mentions. Before his capture in 1593 and his presence in his arrival in Marrakesh, he produces 12 works of uneven significance, uneven quality, I would even say. If they commentaries on grammars, the explication of very basic issues in law and so on. And then in this period, after his arrival, from his arrival in Marrakesh, for about 12 years or so, he is extremely prolific. He writes most of the works that he is famous for. 27 works. I'll mention something about this in a moment. And then he's released in 1607, returns to Timbuktu via a small settlement, and he writes another work in that settlement. I don't know, he's asked for an opinion. Very interestingly, I have to say, he asked for an opinion on the legitimacy or the legality of the use of tobacco. I thought I should raise that for obvious reasons. I saw a cigarette in the image a while ago. Anyway, this whole question of the arrival of new matter, new issues, as they have increasing contact with the world across the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. In any case, that work is a work in between, and he's rather unproductive by the standards of what he did in Marrakesh. So that's his story. I will read to you now from the period of the part of my chapter on Marrakesh, if you don't mind listening to me. So let me stop sharing this for a moment and go to my text. Now I'm getting lost with all these things. So, so news of the defeat of the Songhai army in Gao did not take long to reach Timbuktu. Ahmad Baba and the scholars like those in his family would have heard of those events, but did not expect the town to be the focus of attention from the outside, from the invading army. He kept writing through the early months of the invasion, in fact, finishing a work on the importance of the concept of intention. And the full title of the work is The Superiority of Intention in the Completion of Actions. Timbuktu was coming under attack whilst he was writing about the function of the heart, the mind, and the body in consciously making an intention to do something, and that such intention was superior to action, to mindless action, to deeds without intention. Since there were no local fighters in Timbuktu, there was a clear path for the Saadian soldiers to occupy the town. The disruption of life in Timbuktu did, however, stir its people. The population reacted against the occupation. but this led to more violence against them. In the process, the learned men of the town were forced to play a role, whether as mediators or speaking out against the excesses of the soldiers. The main chronicle of the period, the Tarikh al-Sudan, noted one moment when, quote, the number of people wounded by the musketeers increased. The notables complained to the jurist Qadi Omar, who consulted the men of sound judgment, other scholars, about this. Some counseled that they should be repelled by force if necessary, whilst others advised caution and restraint. Baba would have been among the scholars consulted, since he was from a prominent learned family, and at around 36 years of age, he was senior enough to air his views among the conferring scholars. Noticing the prominence of scholars, the leader of the invasion, Mulay Ahmad Zarqoon, had him arrested along with numerous other scholars. They were led away by soldiers who would probably have taken them to the outskirts of the town, where some form of prison had been constructed by the encampment of the conquering army. After about a month in this prison, which I use, I'm unsure of the term, but it's a kind of prison. After about a month, the prisoners were sent into the desert with a northbound caravan. They were forced to march for at least 3 months across the desert and mountains to banishment in Marrakesh. I described some of the hardship. Ahmad Baba injured himself severely on the route. And later he would complain to the authorities in Marrakesh that his books were taken by the soldiers when he was arrested. He asked for the return of his books. He said famously, I had the smallest library of any of my kin, and they seized 1,600 volumes. Baba is reported to have remarked. Baba and his compatriots arrived in Marrakesh, called the Red City because of the hue of its buildings. He arrived at the end of 1593 or in early 1594. Caravans entering the town did not only raise the dust, but also created an atmosphere of festivity and piqued the curiosity of the locals. Led by the soldiers, this caravan came with looted goods and men, probably some slaves, women and children from the elite of Timbuktu. What remained of the valuable loot taken in the latest round of attacks and the occupation of Timbuktu were taken to the palace quarters as evidence of what the latest in the round of conquest had achieved. Word of the new arrivals spread through the town, and later some of their genealogies probably appeared familiar or were already known. They were kept in captivity until around May 1596, roughly 15 months to 24 months. So Baba was kept in what the literature describes as another prison. The Sultan was also interested in seeing who had been captured and held in his prisons. And in this way, Baba, we don't know if anybody else was asked to an audience with the Sultan or the ruler, but Baba was brought to the Sultan. An historian of the Saadian period, the earliest historian to write about this, writing in the late 17th century, was one Muhammad al-Ifrani, and he wrote about this meeting of the Sultan and Baba. So Baba was taken to an audience with the Sultan, Ahmad al-Mansur, who sat behind a veil so as not to be seen by common subjects, which is not an uncommon thing in various parts of African history, various times and places. We find this phenomenon, and by outsiders like the Timbuktu scholar. One can only imagine Baba's condition after a long march and languishing in prison before the surprise of an order to meet the Sultan. He did not at first see the ruler because the powerful man was hidden behind a veil, but Baba was not intimidated. He in fact tells the Sultan that it is unbecoming of a human being to imitate the Almighty by doing this. And he tells the Sultan, now you're imitating the Lord of the Lords. So if you have anything to say, come down to us and remove the veil. These were powerful words from a captured scholar to a ruler, especially one whose soldiers conquered the lands you were from. So this was a major moment. Baba also protested to the Sultan about the plunder of his library especially, and he denounced the illegitimacy of the invasion. I don't go into detail, but they have a sort of political discussion around the rightfulness of invading the Songhai state. Mansour did not pursue the discussion. He was most probably didn't expect this kind of thing. Now, this is interesting because one of the last works before Baba's capture and exile, which we discussed in the previous chapter, was a work of advice to scholars to avoid rulers. It's a fascinating work which has been far too long hidden, and he in fact lives by his teachings in this exchange with the ruler. So in that chapter, I talk extensively about this work where he advises scholars to stay far away, to not even have tea with the ruler. In this case, you can understand Baba going as a prisoner. We don't know of any of the other scholars who went, but Baba does ask to be released. He is released, but not to go back to Timbuktu. He's released to stay in Marrakesh, and he's allowed to teach. And he takes on the role as a teacher at a small mosque/school. And it appears that this right to teach, as it were, this permission to teach, was because of a lobbying by scholars from Marrakesh. Marrakesh at this time, as I said in the introduction, was flourishing. There were scholars who had come from Fez, from Tlemcen, which is today in Algeria, from all the major towns and cities in the area, from prestigious scholarly lineages. And this is a fascinating issue that they seem to have known of Baba from Timbuktu, and that he gets invited to teach. Why? There certainly wasn't a shortage of teachers or scholars. And so I speculate a bit on this. And we do have some interesting evidence by some of these scholars, and I cite about 5 to 6 of them, where we have snippets of what their impressions of Baba is and their respect. And in fact, some of them study with him, despite the fact that they are judges, that they are scholars. They go and study with him. And what this meant was going to study a book. The process of tuition was getting expertise in a certain work, and you get permission then, once you have mastered the work, to teach the work. So there were disciplines as such existed, but you didn't get trained in a discipline. You got trained in a work, in a book. So he started to teach. But what is also apparent in the literature, and the literature is very thin about it, is that Marrakesh and the region was beset by drought during the entirety of his exile. Drought, severe agricultural shortages, and plagues. The word in French is peste. I don't exactly know the nature of this plague or the nature of this quote-unquote pest. The Arabic word is also very vague, and it covers a number of things. But what I'm trying to say, there was a renaissance flourishing, but there was also difficulty, which I'm trying to introduce and show the kind of unevenness of the experience. Probably he was, it was better than being in prison, but being outside had its being sort of in some kind of house arrest, as it were, had some limitations that all in the city would have had. He could speak Arabic. He spoke Arabic very well, although in one of the observations by one of his students, they say he spoke with an accent, but he could communicate. There wasn't a problem of communication. I mean, that's the first place why he was asked to teach. And he probably spoke a language that is spoken in Timbuktu, such as Songhai or the Arabic Berber dialect called Hassaniya. So whoever was around with him, he could also speak in a local language. Some of the sources say he had family, but there's no evidence of a wife or children. There's one evidence later, much later, of somebody meeting a grandchild of Timbuktu, but of Baba, but it is unclear. So let me just get, since we have a time problem here, what does he do as a scholar? He is most productive in Marrakesh. Let's just go to what he was writing. Even in the period of his imprisonment, before he's released to teach, Baba completed a work on Sufism or mysticism. And this is interesting. Where did he get his writing paper from? How did he sit in prison? How did he manage to complete this work? What was the nature of that prison? But he does include this in this work. He says, quote, despite the condition of restriction and imprisonment that I'm in, students have been frequently coming to me and bringing books with them, which is also revealing. Fortunately enough, not to be isolated and forgotten in prison, he was released, as I said, and lived close to this mosque. This was not the most important mosque / college, because that's how the system worked. The main mosque complex, which was built in the 12th century on the outskirts of which was on the outskirts of the walled city, would have been where scholars close to the Sultan would have taught. So I relate some of the stories about his students, which are quite sort of praising him and give you some data on what life was like. So one of the scholars talks of taking Baba around town to meet other scholars. Let me just get to some of the works. Okay, so I remember I mentioned the first work he wrote whilst he was in prison, and it seems he begins on another work, because 2 years after his release, he brings out a manuscript, and all the books I'm referring to here are, of course, manuscript books. They're not printed books. There's no printing in this region at this period. And so he brings out a 500-page manuscript, which is a biographical dictionary. In printed format, it is 700 words, and I can show you this printed edition I have of this work. And so I assume he was working on this in prison already. And he was able to complete it when he was very soon after he was out of prison. And it is a biographical dictionary that describes in varying length and in varying detail the activities of just over 800 scholars, including his own family, from the Maliki legal school, the dominant school of legal thought and practice in the Maghreb, in Northwest Africa. This is a remarkable achievement, and then which he's most famous for. So it's a work that is constantly consulted even today, and it's a listing of scholars that usually is done at the end of a scholar's career, once he sits, and it's usually he sits on top of his field and is able to decide who belongs and who doesn't belong, he decides who gets a line of entry of 1 line or 12 pages, for instance, or 3 pages. So you would have in this, for instance, Ibn Khaldun, the great historian of North Africa and sociologist, etc. You'd have the luminaries and so on. It's a major scholarly apparatus, and he does this. So he also, for us interested in book history, at the end of the work, he details the 24 works he was able to consult. And it seems that he wasn't able to use this work or didn't have access to this kind of work in Timbuktu. And then 2 years later, he does another version of this. He does a new edition of this work. and with about 100 fewer figures. I'm at the moment trying to figure out who he decided to leave out and who he decided to keep. What was the nature of his decision? The second edition, the second, is usually described as an abridgment because of 100 fewer entries. I'm trying to argue that it's not simply an abridgment. I'm trying to look at what is happening, who is excluding, who is including. He does, for instance, keep Ibn Khaldun. I've read both entries. They are rather similar. But still, it's a massive labor to produce this kind of thing. So 2 years later, he does this again. And what I find working very closely with these two documents is that all his work, in all the work that I've been looking at, it's in a permanent sort of state of progress. So that's why I'm having difficulty saying he produced 56 works or 46 works, because a lot of the works are elaborations or him reworking something. So very much the way in which a modern scholar that we know of, if you find 5 different versions of a text, which one is? It's a challenge, but it's also revealing that we know sort of the working habits of a scholar. So this 2 biographical dictionary problem is not only in this issue, but in a number of other genres that he writes in. I'm finding 2 or 3 slight modifications to the work that he's probably kind of reticent to put out anything very quickly. Okay. So the other work, so in each of the chapters of the book I'm working on, I'm doing this kind of detailed discussion, relatively detailed discussion of the text, of the materiality of the text, of the content, because so little is known, in fact, about him, about his work, about his working method, about the style, about the content. And so in this chapter, I look at another work of his. It's a work on the merits of the scholars over the mystics, over the Sufis, which he completes after the biographical dictionaries. So I'm not going to go into detail about this, but it reveals his method. One doesn't learn from the outset what his opinion is. In fact, right by the end, it is quite difficult to make a judgment. But he's clearly on the side of scholars against mystics. He's clearly on the side of people who can work through rationally a position instead of arguing from inspiration. And he is consistently arguing this case. For instance, as I said, once he leaves and on his way back to Timbuktu, he makes a judgment against the majority opinion on the legality of tobacco, because he found nothing on legal grounds to prohibit the substance. And the title of the work is The Gift of the Persons of Nobility, about the virtues of the scholars. This is the rhyming, sort of very elaborate titles that were given to the titles of works. So I think at the moment, my discussion of this work is a bit too detailed, and I will cut that. But let me conclude with just on leaving Marrakesh. And I'll just read this 2 pages. If Baba was known in Marrakesh from soon after his revival, then his prominence grew with the completion of his books whilst he was there. All his works found copyists, which is a significant factor, because it's not printing, you have to have these things copied. And that ensured circulation beyond the single copy he wrote of himself. And we know in various places there are copies of these works. The copyists could have come from amongst his students, whom I mentioned earlier, from those who were close to him, or those who had come along from Timbuktu, but we know nothing about them. The two biographical dictionaries brought him most attention, more than any other of his works. This was not a genre unfamiliar to his peers, but his works were meant to build on and contribute to this legal school, which was very prominent in Marrakesh. Despite the scholarly community close to him, his relative security, and even some celebrity, he never stopped thinking about his return to Timbuktu. Baba was not known for writing verse, but he composed one poem of longing for Timbuktu, which goes, "O traveler to Gao, the capital of the Songhai Empire, turn off to my city, murmur my name there and greet all my dear ones with scented greetings or salams from an exile who longs for his homeland and neighbors, companions and friends, and condole there in my city, beloved kinsmen, for the passing masters who are buried there," etc., etc. So in his first encounter with the ruler, which we saw, he lives by his teachings, by the text that he had written before he left Timbuktu. And then he, after the death of Mansour, the one he had met, he makes an attempt to approach the new ruler, who finally releases him. He's led to the gates of Marrakesh, and the scholars accompany him, local scholars accompany him, and his words to them is, "May God not bring me back to this place, never return me to these lands." And so that's some parts of my text I'm working on. Okay.
Thanks, Shamil. That's a fascinating history of Ahmad Baba. It should have had a larger audience. I apologize for that. But the YouTube video will be available for... but let's have a discussion, please. As usual, you can just put your hands up using the recording, the hands tool, or you can just turn on your video and ask your question, comments. The floor is open now. Yes, Carolyn, please go ahead.
Thanks, Shamil. I'm so sorry that some of us were late into this, because it was a paper I would have particularly wanted to hear right from the beginning. So my apologies. And if I'm going to ask a question that you've already dealt with, will just be generous to me, please. But it's about the matter of discourse. So understanding that, I'm just wondering to what extent you're able, because you've got iterations, revised versions like the abridged and so on of the same text, and you've got a large corpus of writing across an extended time. Are you at all interested in picking up any discursive shifts, and where would you be looking for them if you were, and what bits of, what conceptual apparatus might be in a kind of state of change or modification at this time? And is that a question of interest to you? And
yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Karen. That's a very good question. Look, as I said in the introduction, I'm doing at the moment a general introduction to Timbuktu with a lot of new material. So and writing it for in a narrative fashion that's readable, without lots of specialist terminology, which some of the stuff is known, some of it is known, not all of it, to a general, in English scholarly sort of none. But when I've been reading the stuff over and rereading the primary sources, as it were, the scholars over the past 50 years, we've just assumed certain things, made simplifications. For instance, the idea of abridgments, it's just everybody repeats abridgment. So I'm trying to to bring materiality much more into it. so at the moment, I'm not focusing on intellectual history, on discursive shifts and so on very closely. I'm much more looking at scholarly habitus and materiality, very much. So, for instance, the question of paper, of his access to paper, of his material circumstances of writing, which doesn't get a mention in the scholarship. So, for a large part, the scholarship has been about the ideas in the head of Ahmad Baba, you know, and a sort of an intellectual history. And by the way, there's only one very slim biography of Baba, a Sorbonne PhD from 1977. I mean, a man of such great productivity has seen one PhD, very slim, but a good guide to his sources, which is just actually quite scandalous. And I'm part of the problem. And that's why I'm trying to do this kind of thing, because why do we know so little? And why is there, the only thing known about Baba is a work on slavery, which is a marginal piece of work of 6 pages, but the Americans love the stuff, you know, the kind of work on a, you know, there's this thing on, you know, there's a market for that kind of thing on slavery, a discourse on slavery, but his discourse on scholars and rulers, his biographical dictionaries, his views on mysticism and rationality, his views on intention. This is sophisticated thinking. It's sophisticated in a Aristotelian sort of, this is not small scale stuff. So there's need for this kind of work that you mentioned, but I'm not at the moment trying to, definitely there is a kind of need for that kind of thing, but it's not the, I've got part of the book, so it's part of a larger book. The book is not focused on him. So it's called Scholars and Collectors. So I'm ending up with collecting in the 20th century, and Baba is the big scholar I'm looking at. And then it comes back to, you know, and therefore the attention to the fact of his books moving with him and so on. He's not really a collector, but he's concerned with people who have books. And then I land up with a man in the early 20th century who was much more of a collector than a scholar. So this is the scholar who has to be a collector, and in the early 20th century, the collector who, for instance, makes copies of Baba's works. So that's the thread that goes through. But thank you, that's an important question.
Lovely stuff. Bodhi has a question. Go ahead, please, Bodhi.
Actually, Shamil has already kind of responded to what I was going to ask, because that's exactly seems to be the very interesting take to me, because I'm slightly familiar with the kind of appropriation of Baba in the entire discourse of slavery, right? I mean, that one book, Miraj, right? That's been
Miraj
Miraj also. That's been the whole thing, and I think Marta Novo kind of argued that he was basically representing the Berber interest and essentially giving a soft interpretation of Maliki jurisprudence so that the impediments to the trans-Saharan slave trade could be removed. And in fact, this was a kind of a soft Maliki version. And then I also read some of Cleveland stuff who argued for more sympathetic kind of description that Baba wasn't racially associating. He emphasized basically his anti-slavery dictum. So coming from there, which always struck me, and if you could elaborate on this, because you kind of actually inspired me a lot in a couple of years ago to read more on Baba, and so I'm coming back as a student who has read some of these kind of secondary literature, having no access to the primary materials in the original language, of course. But I'm kind of, what I found, Shamil, in this historiography is very, very exactly what you were kind of saying, that they seem to be focused on jurisprudence as the sole kind of focus of Baba's intellectual activity, these new kind of North American scholars. while kind of just reading traditional biographies of Baba, I found that, with Baghyu, he was reading on tafsir, he was reading on usul, he was reading on bayan, he was reading on all the areas, right? And language and literature. So my question is exactly that today the North American scholars seems to be even judging the biographical dictionary. If I remember correctly, that how many Black scholars he lists only one, while Berber scholars 9 Berber scholars have been listed, he included himself. That kind of discussion goes on around Baba. So I'm just thinking that if we actually focus on the, particularly Bayan is something that I'm getting increasingly interested in, the question of literary style, but also Arabia, the language stuff. And obviously these are in relation to tafsir or the exegetical question. So I'm kind of interested to know, partly in continuation of Callum's question and in continuation of your initial response, that what a renewed focus on the linguistic and the literary can bring to rethinking Baba's intellectual work, rather than thinking of him as a mere legal scholar and simply as a soft or hard interpreter of the Maliki tradition vis-a-vis trans-Saharan slave trade. So I think that's a very, very interesting kind of intellectual horizon. If you could speak a little bit on that, the move that you seem to be making will be really useful.
Okay, no, thank you, Bodhi. Very good question. So certainly, I didn't want to even talk about. So I do talk very briefly about the text on slavery in the chapter that follows this, because somebody from Tuat, an oasis town about 500 or so kilometers north of Timbuktu, writes to him close to the end of his life. So it's a very late work, and they write to him a question which is filled with anthropological detail about the geography and the ethnography of the regions and who's getting enslaved and so on. And Baba has to respond to this. So it's a very late text. Baba takes a long time to respond. He apologizes for responding so late. And I don't know why this we seem, it's how a sort of contemporary concerns can just pervert the focus on the scholar when, as I said, so much is produced in Marrakesh, so much is produced in before he leaves. He only writes 6 books after his return from Timbuktu, or 6 texts that we have. And as you rightly say, it's not easy. The texts are of a sort of essayistic nature that is not about law. So biography. So it's not this kind of juristic. There's a juristic Baba which is not even that significant. I think he's a far more able, agile intellectual. His work that's I've been translating with my student on scholars and rulers is absolutely fascinating. It doesn't entail a discussion of law at all. It's about ethics. It's actually ethics and scholarly ethics and power, which is interesting. Why it's neglected, and then his work on intention and so on. So look, I think a lifetime's project would be to create a definitive or close to definitive collected edition of his works, because there are texts are strewn all over the place. There's very little editions you can work with. Most of these things are still in primary manuscript form. I mean, the text on slavery is one of the very few that has been edited and published and sort of rigorously. The biographical dictionaries the one is very good, the other one is an uneven value. The text on scholars and rulers, there's a copy in Tamgrut, which is a small isolated village south of Marrakesh. I've asked a colleague to try and get me a copy. At the moment, we've been working from copies except for copy from that area, which would complete the copies we have. So it's classical philological work that it entails. But you're right. I think the juristic can rob us of the full extent of his talents. I think there was a question in the chat.
Can I just draw your attention to one more thing? Sorry.
There is a question at the chat. Can you just answer the question before you come?
There's no question.
Yeah, there is a question.
Yeah.
Sani has a question.
Thank you, Sani. Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. So what we rely on the colophons of the manuscripts to identify copyists. And in the work on scholars and rulers, there were actually no colophons that identify the copyists. So that's unfortunate. But there are copies all over the place. It seems the copies are from much later. That's the other issue. They're not contemporaneous to his time. So we're dealing with lots of challenges from 17th, 18th century copies of texts that were made. The most of his work, of copies of his work, are in Rabat at the moment, and a few in small settlements to the south of Marrakesh. Timbuktu has a few, but that whole world, there are the materials are just enormous amounts of material. Although we don't know if we'll find anything new, but there are enormous amounts of material.
Yeah, sorry, Bodhi, I thought Sani's question would get lost in the chat. Please go ahead.
No, it's absolutely fine. I just wanted to kind of ask Shamil that maybe just going back to the previous kind of point you made, and I know this, I'm actually waiting to read this translation that you're making, scholars and rulers. And one of the things that struck me is there's just a suggestion that I don't know if you have seen Velcheru Narayana Rao's work in South Indian history. He's a friend of Sanjay Subramaniam, and with David Shulman and Sanjay Subramaniam, he published a book, a volume called Textures of Time. I might bring it for you if I manage to go to India. But what kind of strikes me is that also in the 17th century, V. Narayana Rao is asking that in South Asia, particularly in the southern part of South Asia, which again, is part of the Indian Ocean trade, and some of these manuscripts actually had much larger geographical and translated lives than which we are beginning to realize than we realized before. One of the arguments that Narayana Rao is making is that a particular style of writing exactly about the interrelationship of power and ethics, which he kind of summarizes as niti texts, that's the generic name he gives to these texts, that which essentially in Sanskrit means ethics. Niti texts kind of constantly were individual scholars, and even scholars who are struggling for patronage and have very kind of, contested relationship with rulers, both appreciated and exiled. They are trying to devise these tradition of scholarship to reflect on this. And I'm just thinking that in terms of a 17th century history of political thinking infused with thing, this might be just another kind of intellectual formation to have a productive conversation with, rather than just continually commenting on, which you are absolutely trying to get out of, commenting on the contemporary American concerns about slavery being the sole center of African intellectuality.
No, thank you, because there could be a point of convergence there, because what I've done with that text on scholars and politics. So just some background. So there's a genre, Fürstenspiegel, or the Mirror of Princes genre, which is a Persian genre, and South Asians know it very well. There's a European genre. This is somewhere in that, but what usually this would entail is writing a text advising a prince, a ruler. What he does, he doesn't say it openly. So he says, I'm advising the scholars on how to deal with rulers. He's probably very careful, or for some reason he's not doing it. But I've picked out every text that he cites or that he mentions, because I'm interested in what does he have access to. And I've been comparing some of his major quotes with the source that he claims to be citing. And he's got access to the major literature, which is fascinating, how these things get to Timbuktu. So Siraj al-Muluk, which is a fantastic Andalusian work on power and on suhba, which is sitting with rulers, and all these things, which would have been known across the Muslim world and into South Asia. He cites one chapter simply taken from that work. And it's a work of ethics and power. And I compared the two texts. It's very close. He's got versions of these things. So that's, for me, interested in materiality and in the what he has access to, but then also just intellectually, it's a rich, and it is a diverse number of sources that he draws on. And so that's one of the texts that I'm certainly going to publish separately. The biographical dictionaries, I think, are a major repository of information, of sources, of lives of scholars, which I'm still trying to deepen my familiarity with a kind of discourse, what's happening there. But that is also not an unknown genre, like the Mirror of Princes.
Yeah, it's lovely. Other questions and comments? Sorry, I'm looking at the chat. Sandelia has something. Maybe, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, so ancestors, you've heard me say genealogy and lineage. That is the issue in this world. It's your, so often these names are very long, and you give a kind of bow and a recognition to your ancestors through presence of their names in genealogies. It is a huge and very confusing area, because often it's just the same names in a long line of names. But Baba, for instance, comes from the Akit family, and the Akit family arrives in Timbuktu around the 1490s already, from areas to the south. And in that genealogy are very prominent scholars, and in the biographical dictionaries, which could be seen as a work in honor of the ancestors in a way, he has entries on his ancestors, on those in the genealogical line, their works, where they traveled to, other scholars they met, and so on. So that's a kind of, I don't know if that answers you, but there's a constant reference to that. The problem, of course, in the popular discourse, there's a lot of invention of genealogies. And so who is the first ancestor? I mean, it's a big issue in West Africa, but also in places like Ethiopia, where there's a kind of retro attribution of a founding ancestor. And in West Africa, I mean, it's another topic.
I had a small question. That Prince, this genre, it's quite fascinating. I'm sure I'm coming from a place of ignorance, but that's probably a more settled part of this historiography, because I remember in South Asia, again, the Mamluk Sultans, a lot of the texts around, say, the Ghiyazuddin Balban, there is an entire series of texts which we used to read about in our undergraduate courses around these advice to prince, and this ambivalent relationship that the scholars had in doing so. But my question was slightly different. I was wondering about what is and I understand that you're not interested in the per se right now in this project, the intellectual discursive shifts. I was wondering, in this itinerant world, and it seemed the itinerancy kind of came out in your discussion with Bodhi, what is the notion of exilic in the way that you're reading materiality? Because it's already an itinerant world, and they're talking, and he's talking in a form of showing a form of courage, talking to the conqueror, but at the same time he is being met with a certain kind of benevolence of the conqueror. What is the notion of exilic in this material world? Is it something which allows what he would have been doing otherwise? Or is it sort of a luxury nostalgia that he kind of talks about? I'm just curious about that.
No, that's a very good question. Very good. I deliberately kept the title "A Scholar in Exile" because there's so much about scholarship in exile. There's Walzer and Said and refugee. I mean, that's a very kind of contemporary theme, at least for the last 30 or so years. There's been a lot on exiles and scholars and so on. And Baba is obviously, so before I get further, and there's a lot of mobility. This is a nomadic world. This is a nomadic world, and a lot of the education are on the move. People, I mean, in the set of chapters that follows this, I look at the areas to the west, and it's so clear. People were learning to read and write on camelback, and they would go and settle for 6 months, and schools would move. So I'm trying to bring that out. So you're absolutely correct. It's highly mobile. This is Deleuze and Guattari long before they were, nomadism and all this stuff. This is real nomadism. So many of these people are coming from elsewhere. And they're clear about where they're coming from. There's a lot of attention to your ancestor, your genealogical line, and where you came from. So in Baba's name, it's clear where he comes from. He never denies anything. He's got lots of these, what you call, not ethnonyms, but giving your place in his name. Okay, but his move to Marrakesh wasn't out of free will or out of ecological crisis, which the nomads have to move because of pasturage. They have to move seasonally and so on. And even if you're not quote unquote officially a nomad, it's part of your way of life in many ways to move. But he does not move. Nobody moves to Marrakesh out of his free will. It's too far. You die along the way. There's death along the way. These routes, they are bandits. That's something that exists, and it's just hard. You don't know your way. You don't get access to water. I mean, the ethnographies of these things are pretty useful. That I've been looking at how long it takes to move, how many kilometers, and so on. So it takes him 3 months to get to Marrakesh.
Okay.
It takes you 3 months to get to Marrakesh. I mean, so he, despite and that's why I tried to describe some of his circumstances there. It probably wasn't all that bad after his release from prison. The fact that people could visit him and bring him books and paper in prison already, then he's released. My imagination is based on sort of circumstantial evidence. Students do work for these teachers. There's no money changes hands, but they clean up, or they work on the land for this teacher, or they produce, or they bring gifts. So I don't know what the situation was in Marrakesh, but he doesn't choose to stay. He returns, and even to the scholars who treated him so well, he says, I never want to come back to this place. Those last lines, he's kind of very dismissive of these people who had cared for him or had time for him. So that's all I can say. So it was not choice, free choice, as it were. It was pushed. He was forced to go. He was forced to leave, and that's the difference. That's what makes it exile.
Fascinating stuff. Thanks, Shamil. Last round of questions, comments. Otherwise, thank you, Shamil. I see that. I think people are still processing the talk, and look forward to this. Look forward to this in publication in print.
Yes. I'm keen to have this read in the second version of it. So please, if there's anybody who wants to read my,
I would love to. Yeah, that would be great. Please forward it if you want.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining. Apologies again for my fault actually for the mishap around the technical glitch. Next week we're going to have Sean Field, another colleague of ours. So please join us again.